So for years, I've been using template-based forms or template-driven forms in Angular, and they've really never been a point of friction. Um, my forms tend to be very simple, and I don't have a ton of validation, primarily just things that either exist or they don't exist in the form. So template-driven forms have never been an issue. But people in the Angular community just rave about reactive forms. So I wanted to take on first look at reactive forms and just see what they feel like in comparison to template-driven forms. Full caveat, I'm 3 mornings into reactive forms and I'm 7 years into template-driven forms. So it's not really a fair comparison, but let's take a look. To explore this, I created a demo that has both template and reactive form component. And they both do exactly the same thing. They both allow me to add an arbitrary number of pets here. And inside of each pet, I can add an arbitrary number of nicknames. So let's see, so if we do Lucy and we give her a nickname of Pooper and her age is 7, and let's say I can add another pet that's a cat, and let's say his name is Monty and 21, and he died years ago. And if I submit this, you'll see here's our form data. We have a top-level array of pets. Within each pet, you'll see that we have then an array of nicknames, and everything works perfectly well. So let's actually first, before we even look at the template, let's just look at the reactive forms to see that this is really the exact same thing. So again, here I can add Lucy, and the nickname is Stinker, and she is 7. And again, I'll add a cat named Monty, let's say nickname Killa, 21 and deceased. And if we submit that, again, you can see that we have a top level, well, this time it's not a top level value, it's a top level key that is an array of pets, and then each pet again has an array of names. But we can see that the data contained in both the template version and the reactive version are essentially the same, with the top level key being somewhat different. And they're both arbitrarily nested sets of arrays. So there's nothing inherently limiting about templates that we can't have arbitrary data that we can have in reactive forms. Awesome. So now let's take a look at the code. So first, let's just quickly look at the template form. The code behind the template form is fairly simple. This is going to be the interface for our form data. And you can see that the form data here is just simple vanilla JavaScript. It's an object that has a pets key that's an array of pets, and that pet's data type is defined here. If I want to add a pet, it's as simple as grabbing that array, pushing on a new object. And if I want to add a nickname, it's as simple as taking that pet, grabbing that nicknames array, and pushing that value on. And then essentially when I process the form, all I'm doing is taking that vanilla JavaScript array and serializing it. So the code behind for a template form is extremely simple and straightforward. And in fact, if we look at this code, there's really nothing about a template-driven component that tightly couples it to the concept of a form. Sure, I'm calling this key here form, and I'm calling this method process form, but essentially nothing here is non-vanilla, right? There's nothing here that tightly couples the component itself to the fact that we happen to be rendering that data inside of a form within our template. Now the template's fairly complex because we're dealing with some complex nested data. Here we have our form, and then inside of our form we are looping over our collection of pets. But again, this is just a simple ng form. We're used to seeing this. Probably the most complicated part of this whole template is the use of ng model group. ng model group allows us to create a local context for our ng model form controls that allow us to uniquely name a particular control, name a control uniquely to the group as opposed to the entire form itself. And there's some other little various details there that you can see in the write-up. But essentially we say that inside of our pet loop, here is the group for our pet, and then inside of the group for our pet, we name all of our ng model form controls here. We have to provide both a name and the ng model here because it's not a standalone form control. The rest of this is pretty straightforward. You'll see that the for values are somewhat complicated. They require interpolation, but that's because the IDs with a for relationship have to be unique to the page, has nothing to do with Angular forms at all. And then if we get down to our nicknames, again, we're just having a normal ng for of loop looping over the collection of pet.nicknames. Again, these are just simple data values, so we loop over these the way we would loop over any array. And again, we create another model group for our nickname so that our naming here is specific to this iteration, not to the entire form itself. And then the rest here is pretty standard. And you can see that we are disabling the form button if the form, the ng form in this case, or no, sorry, in this case, if the pets don't have any length, or the ng form instance is not valid, and the ng form instance is what we got here from our implicit ng form binding, then we disable that that button. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the template-driven form. Now let's dive into the reactive form, which is again the exact same approach in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Now, the very first thing you'll notice is that we have no interfaces defined in our reactive forms approach, and that's because when we define our public form property here, it's not an object that contains other objects that contain arrays, it's a form group. And currently, as far as I can see, form group can't be typed. It's not a generic, which means that we lose that sort of high-level interface definition for what's going into the form. And here you can see that when we define this form, we're using the form builder, which is a shorthand syntax for explicitly creating all of the form groups, the form arrays, and the form controls, creating a somewhat more simple syntax. And you can see that once we have our forms, if we want to add a pet, we have to get the pets, and the critical point here is that this actually casts from the abstract control down to the form array, and then we push a new group onto that form array, and that has to contain various controls. And the nicknames is not just a simple array, it's actually another form builder dot array. Similarly, when we add a nickname to a pet, we have to get the nicknames from this pet, which again critically casts the abstract control down to a form array, at which point we can push onto it another form builder group here. So what we can immediately see is that, again, we don't have any interfaces. We're also extremely tightly coupling the concept of the view model to the concept of a form, right? Before, with the template-driven approach, all this is simple objects and arrays, right? Objects and arrays, objects and arrays. There's nothing here that says template-driven forms have to define data that goes into a form. Whereas with the reactive form, I'm very loudly saying, hey, this is form data, these are form groups, they're special types of controls, they have all kinds of validity and validations associated with them. And depending on your perspective, that may or may not be of value. In the way that I use forms, that's not particularly helpful because I don't do a ton of validation. Most of my forms are very simple. Most of my requirements are that a value either exists or it doesn't exist. And so this level of coupling between the view model and the form, for me personally, doesn't yet hold a particularly large degree of value in the way that I build my Angular applications. Now, again, I was talking about this having to cast if we jump down to what these do, right? So this is a form control. I have to reach into the form control to get that array, and then I have to cast that as a form array. This is critical because I have to access the controls property of that value eventually, right? So we can see that up. No, I'm not doing here. I'm doing that template. And abstract control doesn't have a controls property, right? So I have to cast that to get it to work. The rest of this is very simple. But now if we look at the reactive form, what we might hope is that the reactive form template is actually quite a bit more simple when compared to the template form. However, what we'll see is that it's actually not any more simple. It's depending on how you look at it, it's actually just a little bit more complex, right? We have similar things, like we have our form group and we have our form group name, which is somewhat like our ng form and our ng model group. But then we also have this form array name, which granted does allow us to define our groups as items within an array, which we couldn't do in the template form. But it was a feature that I didn't leverage anyway. But it does require us to have this additional nesting of elements inside our template here. And then even our ng4s are a bit more complex. Not only do we have to now export an index reference, which we're using to define our form group, you can see that our ng4 is not really just iterating over a simple array anymore. Now we have to get that pets collection, which again, if we look at pets, what we can see here again is it's reaching down into that form structure and casting as an array, as a form array. And we need to cast as a form array, otherwise this dot controls reference here is going to fail to compile with the ahead of time compiling that I'm using. But beyond that, you can see that this is very similar to what we had in our templates. Instead of having the name and both the ng model, you can see that we replace that with the form control name, which takes care of the binding for sort of both of those things. But you can see everything else here is basically just as complicated as it is in the template-driven approach. Maybe there's something I'm missing here, and maybe people with more reactive forms experience can point out the mistakes that I'm making and show me where I can simplify my HTML. But from what I can see, essentially these two templates look more or less exactly alike, with some slightly different directives, and with the reactive form requiring one more level of nesting in DOM nodes and some additional exporting of various for loops. So, I mean, that's essentially a quick comparison there of the two. There's a ton of code, so you have to go through it on your own. But more or less, at least at first blush here, and I know this is not really an honest comparison because I have a 7-year gap in experience comparing template forms to reactive forms. But when I look at template-driven forms, I see nice interfaces, I see very simple data types, I see very simple data manipulation, right? Because we're still just working with objects and arrays and strings and numbers and so on and so forth. And I see HTML that is at worst as complex as the reactive forms template. So from the way that I use forms in my Angular application, at this point, reactive forms don't seem to add much value for the way that I use forms. I don't have interfaces here. I have a significantly, in my opinion, more complex data structure. I have a data structure that is more tightly coupled to the very concept of forms. And I have HTML that is no simpler, no more straightforward than it was with the template-driven approach. So because I don't use a ton of validation and I don't have a lot of complex rules, I don't find there to be a whole lot of value add, again, for the way I use forms at this point in my career. Your mileage will almost certainly vary with your experience and with your business requirements. So anyway, hopefully that's not too much of a biased comparison. And I'm glad that at least I took a look, since now that at least I know what people are talking about, and while I don't understand why they're raving about reactive forms, at least I have grounds to have some sort of a discussion.